Virgin was another good episode. Another underrated episode, I will say. Unfortunately, though, George loses his relationship in this episode. Jerry, though, tries to make progress, but there's a little challenge there in between for him as well. And Kramer faces his own problems with addiction to television in this episode as well. But it's a good episode. I enjoy it. It's also where we do hear the final idea for the pilot, even though, of course, Jerry and George really procrastinated on this and really struggled to come up with an idea with this all in general. But let's talk about it. So the episode starts with Jerry at the improv place where he goes to do some improv. Him and George are just chatting again. They think they're dead because they still have not gotten an idea at all whatsoever. They're basically stuck in where they were in the Cheever letters. We didn't hear anything about the pilot in the opera, but in the Cheever letters, all they got was hi, hello, how are you doing? That's basically all they got in their script. They're supposed to have a meeting with NBC. It's been a month and a half since they accepted the deal. So while they're talking, Jerry looks over and sees this woman, Marla Penny, who works in the closet business, helps organize closets and whatnot. He says that he almost went out with her. He mentioned how he thinks her accent's very sexy and whatnot and all this jazz. But then she told him that she had a boyfriend, so he'd been trying to avoid her for a while. So he said he was going to Berlin. And then of course Marla sees him and say hello. And then Marla's talking to a woman named Stacy. So they're introducing to each other, but then Jerry's kind of giving George that cue to hey, let me go for a few minutes. So George goes over and starts talking to Stacy. And then Jerry's talking with Marla, and Marla's saying, "How was your trip to Berlin?" And there was something going on around that time that Jerry said, the news gave him all the details that he decided not to go. And then she goes, I ended up telling my boyfriend about that. He went over to Berlin. And he said, oh, how do you like it? And she said he never came back. So I don't know what happened. Hopefully, it doesn't sound like it was good, but it's unfortunate though. But meanwhile, though, George is sitting over talking to Stacy, and he's telling him how he's a writer for NBC, and she seemed very interested. George, though, and Jerry later go to Monk's, though, later that night, and George saying how, and this, keep this in mind, too. This isn't the first time that while George was dating Susan, he was interested in going out on another date with another woman. Because in season 7, there's a very, very certain person that George was just mesmerized over the fact that he could have had a date with her, and he could have had her instead of Susan. And also, it led to, I mentioned there's a couple George responses that, my favorite George responses. We've already had one, which was in the Red Dot, where he was like, "What's that wrong? Should I not have done that?" When he got fired after he was reported to have been fooling around with the cleaning lady in his office. But we'll get to that when we get to that season. But it was just so cold, but so funny. But anyways, and then that's when Jerry's saying, "But you got Susan," and he's saying how he's not been feeling happy with Susan. But of course, also saying how even with Susan, he can still see other women, and he goes, "Well, it depends on how serious this one is," and he's asking all these questions. And, basically, he's like, "I tell you what, you got yourself a girlfriend." George's like, "Oh, no." It's like he doesn't want to sound he's committed to one person. And then he's thinking of how he can get rid of Susan, but he doesn't want to break. But the thing is, though, is if he breaks up with Susan, then the NBC deal is ruined. Because she's the one that was behind the idea and got them signed to begin with. Even though how this episode ended, I still don't know how, she still was, well, I don't know. It's complicated to explain right now. We can get to the pilot, probably get more into that. But anyways, so he's trying to find some way to inadvertently get Susan distracted by somebody else. And the only person he could think of was David Letterman, because apparently Susan is a huge fan, and I guess it's like a celebrity crush on David Letterman or something. So he'll be like, if there's some way I can get a hold of David Letterman, then I can maybe work out a deal with him or something. All these deals and whatnot. So, anyways, later Jerry is back at the apartment with Marla, who is helping him with his closet again. But then he hears a noise out in the living room, and it's Kramer watching TV. Kramer had apparently given up his TV to George because he was trying to, cut back on how much TV he watched. But ever since then, he's been watching Jerry's TV all the time. Denying that he has a problem, he says, no, I'll leave you alone later. He goes, and then Jerry says, I'll watch the Knicks game later. Kramer's like, can I come over? Like, he can't let go of this addiction to television. But, but basically, again, he wants Kramer to leave because he has a thing for Marla, and obviously knowing that her boyfriend never came back from Berlin, he thinks he has a shot. So he basically somehow gets, Kramer to get out of the apartment. They start talking, and I'm sorry here. Oh, yeah, of course. So then he basically says that it's too bad. She goes, well, it probably wasn't going to work out anyways. And he's like, oh, why's that? And she goes, well, he had asked her to move in, but she wasn't ready for it yet because she was scared to say it, but then she finally spit it out. She said she's a virgin. And as she said that, Elaine comes in. And obviously, Jerry is not a virgin. So he's not sure if he thinks this would work or not because she's attracted to her. He's attracted to her, but she may not want as much as he does. But Elaine came in, and Elaine starts telling some story, and she even thinks that Marla would appreciate the story. But she starts telling some story about how she was out somewhere and she slammed her purse out and her diaphragm came flying out, which made Marla very uncomfortable, and she leaves. Jerry then mentions, what just happened, and Elaine chases down Marla to go talk to her, to apologize, and kind of, give her a little advice. But before that happened, George came over, and then Jerry tells George that she's a virgin, and they get a discussion, and then they sit down, and they're trying to finally they have only a few hours before they're meeting at NBC. They're trying to come up with something for the pilot. They're just tossing things back and forth. That's working. George has his idea, which Jerry wasn't too keen about, how Jerry gets into a car accident, but it's not his fault. It's the guy who hits him. The guy who hits him, though, does not have insurance, so it goes to court, and the judge says that the guy has to be his butler. Which Jerry's like, nah, I'm not into that. So then they decide, we're going to really think more hard on this. So they order Chinese. And then, of course, Kramer wants to join. But Kramer first was like, I'll eat whatever you guys have. But none of the stuff that they're getting Kramer wants. So Kramer ends up getting his own thing anyway. Meanwhile, Elaine and Marla go to Monk's and they talk a little bit. And she basically kind of gives her some advice about men and about sex. When they came back later, as Jerry and George were still working on the pilot, and then they were waiting for the Chinese food. And Kramer's wondering where it is too. Well, finally, the girls come back. Well, Elaine came back with Marla, and they're with Payne. I guess they were crossing the street, and then Payne was on his bike, and almost hit Elaine and Marla. I think he almost hit Elaine and Marla or something like that, but they got out of the way. But Payne I guess, crashed into a car and hit his head. Head hurts. Head really hurts. So, but then Payne and Elaine start arguing because Elaine's accusing Payne of going too fast. Payne's accusing Elaine of jaywalking. Kramer's still obsessing over the television. Jerry and George can't get this pilot figured out. So it's all a big mess, as always. As a lot of things end up being with, everybody has different thoughts and opinions on what's going on. So then, they get to NBC. and they're still sitting there. They know that they have nothing. They know they're going to completely blow this meeting, and it's probably going to be the end. George, though, sees David Letterman, and he starts following David Letterman to go talk to him. So then Jerry gets called in. So Jerry starts the meeting without George. But in the meeting, though, Russell's not there. Rita, what's her name again? I just saw it a second ago. Her name was Rita, which she plays. She has she does return again at the end of the season, which she's kind of like a bearer of bad news. And you can already tell she's a little more colder than Russell Dalrymple was. But Rita Curson. She was sitting in for Russell because Russell was in L.A. For some with another movie. But of course, Jerry, she's like, so what have you, how's the things coming along? And Jerry just says, good. And the first idea he talks about is the Chinese restaurant, which none of them are interested in whatsoever. And Rita's like, that's the idea? That's the best you got? And he was like, well, there's multiple ideas, which of course that plays on the fact that, again, when they did do the Chinese restaurant for real, NBC was not for that. Like I said when I reviewed that episode, that was like the make it or break it episode of Seinfeld. Like they did not think, they were not crazy about that idea at all whatsoever. So then Jerry pitches the idea that George said about how he gets in an accident and it was not his fault, it was the guy who hit him, it was his fault, but he has no insurance, so the judge makes the guy be Jerry's butler. And they started laughing. They found their story, which eventually does become the story of the pilot for the Jerry show, which of course we'll talk about that in the two-part finale of this season. But then George walks in and he goes, are you telling the story about the butler? And he's like, yeah, and he's saying hi to everyone. He was introduced to Rita, but then he goes over to Susan and he kisses her. And Susan looks super uncomfortable, and Rita, just cold and calculated as she just looks, is staring down Susan. So then later, Jerry and George arrive back at the apartment. Kramer, of course, is still watching his television, and he's still and Jerry's begging George to give Kramer his TV back. So then Kramer, though, who's watching Jeopardy at the time and guessing all these answers, getting them correct, says that Susan had called asking to talk to George. So he calls her back. Susan was fired because George kissed her. Rita had called Russell. Russell had fired her over the phone. George says, I'm so sorry, and then of course she keeps calling George a stupid idiot. You stupid idiot! Just like Chris Jericho did. And then she says she'll talk to them later. And then George's all excited. Well, first off, George did talk to Letterman, but he had no luck. But George was excited, though, because he was just like, that's it. She's fired. I have my way out. I can break up with her now. And Jerry's like, no, you can't do that. You gotta be there for her. You're the one who got her fired. At least wait until she gets another job. At least get a couple interviews. And for the first time in the series, George says the famous line, which I think from one of the Godfathers, I believe, was, every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. Which, of course, is one of my favorite George lines also as well. But Susan, in the end, breaks up with George. But I still, even though, I'll say I wasn't going to get this till later, but even though, I'm still confused, why did they still go through with the show if they knew George was having a romantic relationship with Susan, and obviously Susan was the biggest supporter of the show? So why I still went through with that, I'm not sure. But of course, we all know what happens later on. This Rita Curson lady plays a big role in it, unfortunately. But we'll talk about that, of course, when we get to the finale of this season, which still have a little bit of ways to go, but we're flying through pretty quickly. And then there's a scene where Jerry and Marla are making out in the closet. But then Marla was saying, because the one takeaway she got from it was that men usually like to leave after sex. So she's asking Jerry, are you going to want to leave? And then, Jerry was saying, like the complete opposite was Elaine was telling her. But then Marla was like, maybe I should leave. Like, it wasn't a breakup, but it was more so like I'm not quite ready yet for this, basically. She was confused and didn't know what to do. So then, of course, Jerry is with Elaine at the Improv talking about that, and, and apparently Ping is suing Elaine now for his accident. So she's like, be nice to Marla because I need her as my witness. Which, of course, is not going to be a good story because, in the next episode, her and Jerry go Splitsville, of course, in what is probably the best episode, which gets that in momentarily. But George, meanwhile, free as a bird now because Susan dumped him, is talking to this woman. And the whole point of this was George thought that him telling people he was a writer for NBC was going to, be a good pickup line for women. When this lady finds out it's a sitcom, she makes fun of him about it, laughs in his face, and just walks away. She's like, and he used that to hit on me. So George got the backhand with that, thinking that he could use his job as a pickup line to get women. And unfortunately, it worked for Stacy. Did not work though for whoever this lady's name was. But of course, like I said, this was not the first time that George was falling for someone, or George could have had a date with somebody else while with Susan. Just you wait till season 7. I cannot wait to talk about that moment. That cold-hearted but hilarious line, But that's The Virgin. Again, good episode for sure. Definitely underrated also. Again, most season 4's episodes are pretty good to me. The next one we do. Next one is the big one. Next one's the Emmy. It's the one I talked about in the breakthrough season that just, you didn't want to come into work next day without talking about this episode. As Warren Littlefield said, this next episode is a prime example of water cooler television. It got an Emmy, and it was really the episode that really had Seinfeld setting off as the show. This is definitely the best episode in the series. Next. What is the episode, of course? We'll talk about that next. Guys, what are your thoughts again on the Virgin episode of Seinfeld? Leave your thoughts down in the comments section below. Be sure as always to slap a like on the video. Subscribe for more content on my channel. And follow me on Twitter as well at DemandAirboy93. Till then, guys, I'm checking out. I'll catch y'all later. Peace out, everybody.